The man I just saved is my daughter's father, and he doesn't even know she exists.
The storm hit Manhattan the way it always did in October. Not gradually, not with warning, just a wall of black cloud rolling in from the Atlantic, swallowing the skyline building by building until the lights of Midtown looked like candles burning underwater. Rain came sideways. Wind bent the street trees nearly in half. And in the cardiac surgery wing of Crown Metropolitan Hospital on the Upper East Side, Dr. Vivian Hartwell was elbow deep in a man's chest, keeping him alive with nothing but her hands and whatever God had given her in place of fear. She had been on shift for 14 hours. She did not feel it. This was the thing about Vivian that her residents talked about in the break room. The thing that made the younger nurses slightly afraid of her and the older ones deeply respectful. She did not feel exhaustion the way other people did. She did not feel it in her hands, did not feel it in her eyes, did not let it anywhere near the part of her brain that made decisions inside an operating room. Pain was something that happened to her patients. Fatigue was something she processed later alone in the dark of a Brooklyn apartment after Nora was asleep, when there was no one watching and no one who needed her to be steady. She was always steady. She closed the chest, dictated her notes in a voice that betrayed nothing, stripped off her gloves, and walked toward the scrub sink. The clock on the wall said 11:47. The storm outside said it would be a long night. Dr. Sloan Merritt was waiting by the coffee machine when Vivian came through the door. Sloan was 40 years old, had been the attending physician during Vivian's residency 6 years ago, and knew better than anyone on staff how to read the weather behind Vivian's eyes. "You look terrible," Sloan said. "I look fine. You have been on since 6 this morning. I have one more consult." Sloan handed her a coffee cup that smelled like it had been sitting on the burner since noon. Vivian drank it anyway. "Nora asked about you," Sloan said. "I saw Mrs. Paulson in the lobby this afternoon. She said Nora drew something for you. A lion, apparently." Vivian felt something shift in her chest, small but real. "She has been drawing a lot lately," Vivian said. "She is 7. 7-year-olds draw. She draws lions specifically every time." Sloan looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for conversations Vivian was not ready to have. It was a look that said she knew things she was not going to say out loud. Not yet. "Go home," Sloan said. "I will cover the consult. I am fine." "You always say that, because it is always true." Vivian walked out before Sloan could argue. The thing about Crown Metropolitan was that it never went quiet. Not at midnight, not at 3 in the morning, not during blizzards or blackouts, or the kind of storms that made taxi drivers pull over and wait. The emergency bay never stopped receiving. The monitors never stopped beeping. And the cardiac unit, which sat on the 4th floor with a view of the East River that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, operated on a frequency of controlled crisis that Vivian had long ago stopped hearing as noise. She had made her peace with the hospital the way soldiers made their peace with their foxholes. It was not home. It was not comfort, but it was the one place in the world where she understood the rules completely, where every variable had a name, where she knew exactly what to do when something went wrong. Outside these walls, the rules were different. Outside these walls, she was less certain. She was halfway down the corridor toward the elevator when the trauma bay doors exploded open. The sound was specific. Anyone who worked in a trauma center long enough learned to distinguish the ordinary swing of those doors from the emergency swing, the one that meant the paramedics were running, one that meant whatever was on the gurney had minutes and not hours. Vivian heard it and turned without thinking. The gurney came through fast. 2 paramedics, one pressing both hands against a compress soaked dark red, the other squeezing a bag valve mask with the focused rhythm of someone who had been doing it since the ambulance bay. A 3rd technician shouted vitals as she ran alongside. Male, late 30s, 4 gunshot wounds, 2 to the left thorax, 1 to the right flank, 1 to the upper left shoulder. BP 60/40 and dropping. Pulse thready. Lost consciousness twice in row. GCS7. Behind them, through the still swinging doors, Vivian could see 2 black SUVs idling at the curb in the rain. Men in dark coats standing outside them. Standing perfectly still, despite the downpour, the way men stood when they were trained to stand, and not when they were simply waiting. She noted this the way she noted everything, filed it, moved toward the bay. The trauma team was already assembling. Sloan appeared from somewhere behind her, already gloved, already in the controlled sprint that passed for running in a hospital corridor. Residents flanked the gurney from both sides. A nurse called out the defibrillator status. Another was already cutting away the soaked clothing. Vivian stepped to the head of the gurney. She looked down, and the next 3 seconds happened the way car accidents happened, in a compression of time that felt both instantaneous and impossibly slow. In a silence that had no business existing inside a trauma bay, in a space where her clinical mind and everything else she had built in the last 7 years simply stopped functioning at the same time. The man on the gurney was Dorian Fisk. She knew his face the way she knew the chambers of a heart. Not because she had studied it, not because she had tried to memorize it, but because for 2 years it had been the last thing she saw before she fell asleep. And for 5 years after that, it had been the thing she tried hardest to forget. The jaw was the same. The line of his brow was the same. He was older, harder. There were scars on his neck she had not put there and shadows under his eyes that spoke of years she had not been part of. But it was him, Dorian Fisk, the man who had proposed to her on a rooftop in Midtown on a Thursday night in early spring. The man who had held her face in both hands and promised her forever in the voice people used when they meant it. The man who had left a note on her kitchen table 7 years ago that said only "I am sorry" and had not been heard from since. She had sold the engagement ring 4 months after he left, walked into a pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue on a gray February morning, and set it on the counter without drama. The money had paid for her second year of residency. She had walked past that pawn shop twice a week for the following 4 years on her way to the subway, and each time she had not looked at the window, and each time she had been aware of not looking. 3 seconds. She came back. "Vivian." Sloane's voice was sharp and low directly in her ear. "You with me?" It was not a question. Vivian looked up from Dorian's face and met Sloane's eyes across the gurney. Sloane had seen the 3 seconds. Sloane had seen all of it. Her expression asked nothing and demanded everything. Vivian snapped her gloves tighter against her wrists. "Talk to me," she said. "What are we looking at?" The resident pressed a stethoscope to Dorian's chest. Breath sounds absent on the left. Probable hemothorax. Possible tension on the right side. Bullet in the left thoracic cavity is sitting close to the pericardium. She processed this the way she processed everything inside these walls. Quickly, cleanly, without the weight of what it meant attached to any of it. "Chest tube, now." The nurse put the instrument in her hand. Vivian made the incision with the precision that 7 years of cardiac surgery produced, the kind of precision that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the 10,000 hours before this moment. The tube went in. Dark blood filled the collection chamber immediately. "Hemothorax confirmed," she said. "He is bleeding into the chest cavity. We need him in the OR before he exsanguinates." Sloane OR 2. "Ready and prepped," Sloane said. "Then move." They moved. The transfer from this trauma bay to the OR took 90 seconds. Vivian ran beside the gurney with one hand pressed to Dorian's chest, monitoring his breathing, running calculations in the part of her mind that never went offline. Bullet trajectory, likely organ involvement, volume of blood loss, survival probability if she was fast enough and precise enough and did not at any point in the next 3 hours allow herself to feel a single thing about the man whose chest she was about to open. She did not allow herself to feel it. She did not allow herself to remember the note on the table, the ring she had walked past twice a week for 4 years, the morning she had sat on the bathroom floor of her Brooklyn apartment and read a pregnancy test alone, the October light coming through the frosted window, the silence in the apartment so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She scrubbed in. She positioned herself at the table. She took one breath. Then she cut. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 11 minutes. 2 bullets came out. The third, lodged near the pericardium, required a level of precision that made one of her residents audibly exhale when she extracted it intact without nicking the cardiac sac. The fourth bullet, the one in the right flank, had traveled further than the imaging suggested and required an additional 40 minutes of work that no one on the team had anticipated. She did not think about Dorian Fisk during those 3 hours. She thought about pressure differentials and suture tension and the sound a compromised aorta made when it was about to give. She thought about the angle of approach and the depth of the cavity and the weight of the instrument in her hand. She thought about every technical variable that existed between that man staying alive and the alternative. She did not think about the note. When it was over, when the chest was closed and the vitals were stabilizing and the team was beginning to speak in the quieter register that meant the crisis had passed, She stripped off her gloves and walked out before anyone could see the tremor in her hands. She stood in the corridor outside OR2 for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. The floor was the color of institutional linoleum that existed only in hospitals and government buildings. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady mechanical patience. Sloan came through the door 30 seconds later. They stood side by side without speaking. "He is going to make it," Sloan said finally. Vivian did not answer. "Who is he?" It was not the first time Sloan had asked a question that sounded like a statement. Vivian had spent 6 years learning that when Sloan used that tone, the question was not going away. "Someone I used to know," Vivian said. Sloan waited. "Someone I used to know very well." Sloan was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the directness that had always been her defining quality, "Is he Nora's father?" Vivian said nothing. That was the answer. She checked his vitals 3 times in the ICU before she let herself go home. Each time she stood in the doorway of his room and looked at him through the glass at the machines, monitoring the heart she had just put back together, at the chest rising and falling, with the mechanical steadiness of sedation. Each time she told herself she was checking because he was her patient. Each time she walked away, knowing that was not the only reason. At 2 in the morning, she called Mrs. Paulson. "She is asleep," Mrs. Paulson said. "She waited up until 11. She drew you something." "I know. I will be home soon." There was a pause. "You say that a lot, dear." "I will be home in an hour." She was home in 40 minutes. The apartment was quiet the way Brooklyn apartments got quiet after midnight, a kind of urban stillness that was never actually silence but that had its own texture. She came through the door and stood in the dark hallway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her pulse come down from the frequency it had been running at since she first saw Dorian's face. Then a small voice came from the hallway. "Mama." Nora was standing in the doorway of her bedroom. 7 years old, dark hair loose from whatever braid Mrs. Paulson had put in it, wearing the pajamas with the small geometric shapes that she had selected herself at the store last month and considered deeply important. Her eyes were the amber brown that Vivian had spent 7 years not thinking about the origin of. She was holding a folded piece of paper. "Hey, baby," Vivian said, and crossed the apartment in the dark and picked her up. Nora pressed her face against Vivian's neck the way she had done since she was an infant, with the total trust that children carried before the world taught them to be careful with it. "You smell like the hospital," Nora said. "I was at the hospital." "You are always at the hospital." "I know. I am sorry." Nora leaned back and held out the folded paper. "I made you something." Vivian took it, unfolded it in the dim light from the hallway. A lion drawn in crayon with the particular detail that Nora applied to lions, and only lions with a mane that took up most of the page, and eyes that were amber and serious. In the corner in the labored printing of a 7-year-old still working on her letters, it said, "For Mama." She is perfect, Vivian thought. She is so completely perfect, and she looks so much like him that sometimes it stops my heart. She held Nora tighter and did not say any of this out loud. She carried her back to bed, tucked her in, sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark, until Nora's breathing slowed into sleep. Then she went to her own room and sat on the edge of her own bed and looked at the drawing in her hands. She thought about the pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue, about the February morning and the gray light and the rings set on the counter without drama, about walking past that window twice a week for 4 years afterward and training herself not to look and always being aware of not looking. And for the first time in 7 years, she cried. Not because of what she had lost, not because of the note or the ring or the years of building something out of nothing with no one to help her. She cried because of what was lying in an ICU room 20 blocks away, connected to machines and breathing in the thin mechanical way of the seriously wounded, because of what that meant for the 7-year-old sleeping down the hall who had drawn a lion and written for Mama in careful letters and had the same amber eyes as a man who did not know she existed. She cried for exactly 4 minutes. Then she stopped, washed her face, set her alarm for 6, and lay in the dark for the rest of the night, waiting for it. He was awake the next morning. She had not expected this. The anesthesia alone should have kept him under until mid-afternoon. But when she came through the door of his ICU room at 7:45 chart in hand, professional mask fully assembled, she found him already conscious, watching the door, as though he had known she was coming. His face was pale. The monitors tracking his vitals showed numbers that were stable, but cautious, the stability of a body that had decided to survive, but had not yet decided how it felt about that. There were bandages across his chest and a line in his left arm and a hollowness in his face that came from blood loss and surgery and whatever years had done to him since she last saw him. He looked like Dorian Fisk. He looked nothing like the man she remembered. Both of these things were true at the same time. She stopped at the foot of his bed, opened his chart, read it with the performance of clinical detachment she had been perfecting since the previous night. "How are you feeling?" she said. It came out the way she intended, neutral, informational, the voice she used with every post-surgical patient on every ordinary morning. Dorian watched her. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered. Something in it had been worn down like wood left out in too many seasons. But the cadence was the same. She had cataloged that cadence somewhere she had not consciously chosen in the part of memory that operated without permission. "That is my job," she said. "Vivian, don't." She did not look up from the chart. "You do not get to use my name like that. Not in here, not this morning." He was quiet. She turned a page she had already read. Then he said, "I know I do not have the right to explain." "No, you do not. I am going to anyway." She looked up. His eyes were the same. That was the thing she had not prepared herself for. The eyes being exactly the same, the quality of attention in them, the way he looked at her like she was the only moving object in the room. It had been one of the first things she noticed about him 11 years ago, and it was apparently the one thing that years and violence and whatever had happened to him had not been able to change. "Colt Stredwick," he said. She did not react. "He was my underboss for 15 years. I trusted him with everything. And 7 years ago, when I started dismantling the trafficking operations my father had built, when I started pulling the threads of the parts of that world I wanted to destroy, he found out. He sent me photographs of you walking to the hospital, of your apartment building, of the coffee shop on DeKalb where you went on Saturday mornings. He said she dies the moment you push back further. He said disappear or she does not wake up." Vivian's hands were still on the chart. "You should have told me," she said. "I could not risk it. If you knew, you would have fought back. You would have made noise. And noise was exactly what he needed to justify the order. So you just left. I chose to lose you instead of lose you permanently." He said this quietly, the way a person said something they had been carrying for a long time and had stopped expecting relief from. "I know how that sounds. I know what it cost you. I am not asking you to understand it. I am asking you to know it." She stood at the foot of his bed for a long moment. The monitor beeped its indifferent rhythm. "Did it work?" she finally asked. 7 years of this plan of yours. Did it work? "Stredwick is still operational. I got close last year. That is why I am in your hospital at midnight with 4 bullet holes in my chest. I got close and he got there first." Vivian absorbed this. "And now," she said, "now the people he sent are dead, and I have a window. But Rowan Caruso, the man Stredwick has been working with for the last 3 years, knows my name and my face and the fact that I am still alive. And that means this is not finished." She set the chart down on the end of the bed. She looked at him, and then she said the thing she had not meant to say, the thing that had been building since 2 in the morning when she sat on the edge of her bed with a drawing of a lion in her hands and cried for 4 minutes. The thing that came out not because she chose it, but because 7 years of wait has a pressure of its own, and it finds the cracks eventually. "She is 7, she said. "Her name is Nora." The room changed. It was not something she could have described to anyone who was not in it. Nothing moved. The monitors kept beeping. The October light was coming through the blinds at its morning angle, pale and specific. Nothing in the room changed. And yet the room changed completely. Dorian had gone absolutely still. Not the stillness of sleep or sedation. The stillness of a man who has heard something that has reorganized every fact he believed about the last 7 years in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He looked at her. She held his gaze. 7, he said. "Yes, she was. When you left." Vivian said nothing. She did not need to say anything. The math was the same for both of them. He closed his eyes. She watched him. She had not planned to stay. She had not planned to feel anything other than the cold and competent calm she had been running on since the previous night. But she stood there at the foot of his bed and watched the man who had left absorb the fact of what he had left, and she found she could not make herself walk out of the room. "I did not know," he said. His voice had changed. Something in it had come apart. "I need you to know that I did not know." "I know you did not know," she said. "I know. What is she like?" Vivian thought about the lion drawing. about the careful letters, about amber eyes in a dark hallway at 2 in the morning. Serious, she said. She thinks before she speaks. She draws lions. Why lions? I do not know. She just always has. He opened his eyes. They were wet. He did not attempt to conceal this. Can I? He stopped, started again. I do not know yet, Vivian said. I need you to understand what you are asking. She has built a complete life without you in it. She has not built it around a hole where you should be. She has just built it. And I am not going to take a wrecking ball to that because you are alive and in my hospital. I understand. I am not sure you do. Then tell me what understanding looks like. Vivian picked up the chart, held it in her hands without reading it. It looks like me deciding, she said. Not you, me. He nodded once. She walked out. 3 days passed. Vivian worked her shifts. She monitored Dorian's chart through Sloan, who said nothing and noticed everything and brought Vivian coffee at odd hours without being asked. Nora went to school and came home and drew things and told Vivian about a girl in her class named Sarah who had brought a caterpillar to school in a jar and about a disagreement she was having with her best friend about the correct rules of a game at recess. The ordinary architecture of a 7-year-old's life. The architecture Vivian had spent 7 years carefully constructing. On the 4th day, Sloan came to find her during a break between surgeries. He is asking for you, Sloan said. Vivian did not respond immediately. He also asked the night nurse to bring him a legal pad and a pen. She said he spent 4 hours writing something, and she does not know what. Vivian thought about this. She went to see him that afternoon. He was sitting up in bed. The legal pad was on the table beside him, covered in handwriting. He saw her look at it and turned it face down. That was not what this was about. I want to apologize for something I said the first morning, he said. When I asked about her, I was not thinking about what it meant for you. I was only thinking about myself, about wanting to see her. She waited. If you decide she should not know about me, I will accept that. I will accept it completely. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had left and the man who had come back, and the fact that she could not yet determine how much space existed between those two things. I have been thinking about it, she said, and she is 7 years old. She asks about her father the way 7-year-olds ask about things they have learned to accept the absence of. Not constantly, not desperately, just sometimes. The way you notice a gap. Dorian said nothing. She deserves to make her own assessment, Vivian said. That is what I keep coming back to. She is a person. She is not a decision I get to make entirely on her behalf. What are you saying? I am saying she can meet you, once, under conditions I set, and I will be watching every second of it. Vivian, don't, she said again. We are not there yet. We may not get there. Do you understand? Yes. She left without saying anything else. She picked Nora up from school the following afternoon. Nora talked for the entire subway ride about a book she was reading, about a science project involving water displacement, about the fact that her sneaker had come untied 3 times during gym class, and she had a theory about why. Vivian listened and gave the appropriate responses and tried not to think about where they were going. They came through the door of the hospital and Nora stopped talking. She looked around the lobby with the focused attention she brought to new environments. Filed everything. Looked up at Vivian. Who are we visiting, she asked. Someone I used to know, Vivian said. A long time ago. He has been sick. Nora considered this. Okay, she said, and went back to watching the elevator buttons. When they came through the door of Dorian's room, he was standing by the window. He had been moved out of the ICU that morning. He was dressed in street clothes. Someone had brought him dark trousers and a plain dark shirt, the hospital gown folded on the chair. He looked like himself. He looked like someone trying not to look like he had been waiting. When he saw Nora, he went completely still. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at him with the serious and thorough attention she applied to everything. She took in his face, his hands, the way he was standing. She tilted her head very slightly, the tilt she used when she was processing something that required more consideration than usual. Then she said, "You have the same nose as me." Dorian looked at Vivian, one glance. Then he looked back at Nora. "I think you might be right," he said. His voice was carefully even. Nora stepped into the room. She pulled off her backpack and set it on the floor and unzipped it with the methodical focus of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She extracted a folded piece of paper. A lion. Larger than the ones she drew at home, filling the entire page with careful attention paid to the eyes. "I drew this at school today," she said. She walked across the room and held it out to Dorian. "You can have it if you want." He took it from her with both hands. He held it for a moment without speaking. Vivian watched him look at the drawing and then look at their daughter and look at the drawing again. She watched him work to keep his face neutral, and she watched how much effort that cost him, and she watched the way it failed at the edges, just slightly, in the quality of his breathing. "Thank you," he said. "I draw lions." Mostly, Nora said, settling herself into the chair beside the bed, with the authority of a child who had decided the room was acceptable. "What do you like to draw?" "I do not draw." Nora considered this. "You should try. It helps when things are hard." Dorian looked at her. "Who told you that?" he asked. "I figured it out," Nora said simply. They talked for an hour. Nora did most of the talking the way she always did when she had decided a situation was worth her attention. She told him about her science project and about the documentary she had watched about deep-sea fish and about the disagreement with her teacher over the spelling of a word that Nora had been entirely right about. Dorian listened the way Vivian had seen him listen to things that mattered to him, with full attention, with the stillness of a person for whom listening was never passive. Vivian stood by the door and watched them and felt something in her chest moving that she did not yet have a name for. That evening, after Mrs. Paulson had collected Nora, Vivian came back one last time. She told herself she was checking his chart. She walked to his door, looked through the glass at him, sitting in the chair by the window, and told herself to keep walking. She pushed the door open. He looked up. She sat in the chair on the other side of the room. Not close, just in the same room. "She told me you have the same nose," he said. "She tells everyone what she notices," Vivian said. "She always has." He looked down at the lion drawing which he had set on the table beside him. "She is extraordinary," he said. "Yes," Vivian said, "she is." Silence. The silence of two people who have something enormous between them and are not yet sure what to do with it. Then Dorian said, "I am going to finish this. Stredwick and Caruso, I'm going to finish it." "And then what?" "And then I am coming back." Vivian looked at him. "The last time you told me you were coming back," she said, "you left a note on my kitchen table that said, 'I am sorry.'" "I know. I sold the ring to pay for my second year of residency. I walked past the pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue twice a week for 4 years afterward, and I trained myself not to look at the window, and I was always aware of not looking." He absorbed this without flinching. "This time is different," he said. "You sound very certain. I have something to come back for now." Vivian stood, walked to the door, stopped. She stood with her hand on the frame and looked at the window and the October dark beyond it and the lights of the East River in the distance. "Nora asked me once if you were a firefighter," she said. "When she was 5. Her friend's father came to career day, and she came home and asked me if her dad was a firefighter, or maybe a doctor like me. She was very specific about those being the two most likely options." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were complicated." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and was something sadder than that. "She is going to have questions," Vivian said, "when she is older. She is going to want the whole truth of it, and I am not going to lie to her. I know. The things you have done, the things you have been. She deserves to know all of it eventually." "I know that too." Vivian turned. "Come back," she said. "Come back and be worth it." She walked out into the corridor without looking back, took the elevator down to the lobby, and walked through the revolving door into the cold Manhattan night where the storm had passed and the streets were still wet, and the city was running its late shift hum, indifferent and magnificent and entirely unchanged. She stood on the sidewalk, looked up at the 4th floor. The light in his room was still on. She had not felt the cold until now. She pulled her coat tighter and began walking toward the subway. 7 years of one kind of life behind her. Something she did not have a name for yet, beginning in the space where the 7 years had been. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Mrs. Paulson, Nora drew another lion tonight. This one has 2 people standing next to it. She says it is not finished yet." Vivian stopped walking, stood on the wet sidewalk in the October dark with her phone in her hand. "Read the message twice." Then she put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. Because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. She kept moving, kept working, kept building the one day at a time structure of a life that was hers entirely and no one else's. But something in her chest that had been locked for 7 years was no longer quite as locked as it had been yesterday. And she was not yet certain whether that terrified her or felt for the first time in a very long time like the beginning of something she might actually survive. The weeks that followed had their own particular texture. Not dramatic, not obviously changed. The hospital, the surgeries, The school runs the evenings in the Brooklyn apartment with Nora drawing at the kitchen table, while Vivian reviewed patient files and the city made its continuous sound outside the window. The ordinary material of a life that looked from the outside exactly as it had always looked. But Dorian called every evening at 8:43. The precision of it was unintentional, she was certain of that, but it was consistent, and she found herself noticing when she was still in the hospital at 8:42 and moving toward the elevator without fully deciding to. The first call lasted 4 minutes. He asked how she was. She said fine. He asked about Nora. She said Nora was drawing. Tell her I still have the line, he said. By the end of the first week, Nora had noticed the pattern and begun appearing in the kitchen at 8:30 with the timing of someone who had decided to participate in something without being officially invited. Vivian would answer, exchange a few minutes of careful conversation with Dorian, and then Nora would hold out her hand for the phone with the matter-of-fact authority of a 7-year-old who had made a unilateral decision. Vivian handed it over every time. She told herself she was observing, that this was data she needed to make the larger decision she had not yet finished making. She sat in the kitchen and listened to Nora tell Dorian about her science project, about the documentary on deep-sea fish, about the argument with her teacher over spelling that Nora brought up again because she had not finished being right about it the first time. Dorian listened the way he had listened in the hospital room, with full attention, with the stillness of a person for whom listening to this particular child was not something he was willing to do partially. She noticed this. She noted it in the column she was keeping in her head, the one organizing itself around a question she had not yet put into words. Nora drew a new line on the 16th evening after Dorian's discharge. This one had 3 figures standing next to it. 2 clear and detailed, the third slightly rougher, added carefully. Not finished, Nora had written in the corner. Vivian left it on the refrigerator door and did not say anything about it. On the 17th evening, Nora asked her directly. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. Nora had finished her homework and moved on to drawing as she always did, the transition seamless and natural. The lamp on the counter made the kitchen warm. Outside, the November wind had started doing the thing it did when winter was still a week away, but had already sent its advance notice. Mom, Nora said without looking up from the page. Yes, is Dorian my father? Vivian did not move. She kept her hands around the coffee cup. She kept her breathing even and her face neutral, and she looked at her daughter drawing and thought about all the answers she had considered preparing for this question over the last 3 weeks, and found that none of them were the right answer, and that the right answer was the simplest one. Yes, she said. Nora kept drawing. Why did he go away, she asked. He thought it was the only way to keep us safe, Vivian said. Nora considered this. Was he right? No, Vivian said. He was wrong about the method, but he was not wrong about the reason. Nora was quiet for a moment. The pencil moved. The lion was getting a new detail in the main, something she had decided needed adjusting. Is he going to stay this time, Nora asked. That is what he says, Vivian said. Do you believe him? Vivian looked at her daughter, at the top of her dark head bent over the drawing, at the amber eyes that would look up in a moment and ask the follow-up question, because Nora always asked the follow-up question. I'm working on it, she said. Nora looked up. That is an honest answer, she said. Yes, Vivian said. It is. Nora went back to drawing. I like him, Nora said after another minute. He listens when I talk. Some adults do not really listen. They just wait. He was always a good listener, Vivian said. You should tell him what you told me, Nora said. What did I tell you? That you are working on it. Nora turned the page. He should know. Vivian looked at her daughter for a long moment. When did you become so practical? She asked. I have always been practical, Nora said, and selected a different pencil. She called Dorian that night after Nora was asleep. He answered immediately the way he always answered immediately, as though the possibility of missing a call from this number was not something he was prepared to entertain. She told him about the conversation. Not all of it, the part that mattered. She knows, Vivian said. I did not plan to tell her yet, but she asked directly, and I answered honestly. How is she? She is fine. She said she likes you because you actually listen when she talks. He was quiet for a moment. She told me to tell you something, Vivian said. What? She said you should know that I am working on it. Another silence. Longer. Then he said, I will take that. I know you will, Vivian said. She almost said something else. Almost crossed a distance she was not yet ready to cross. She could feel the edge of it. The place where the 7 years and the note and the ring and the bathroom floor and the pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue and all the rest of it ended and whatever came next began. She was not there yet, but she was closer than she had been the day before. Good night, she said. Good night, Vivian. She set the phone down and sat in the kitchen for a while longer. The lion drawing was on the refrigerator door. The third figure in it was more detailed than the other two now, something Nora had been working on in increments without announcing it. The hand almost touched the shoulder of the shorter figure. Almost. Not finished, it still said in the corner. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. On the 22nd evening, Sloane called instead of texting. This was unusual. Sloane communicated by text, as a rule concise and specific, a habit developed during years of hospital work where written records mattered. A phone call meant something that could not be compressed. Vivian answered on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," Sloane said, "and I need you to stay calm while I tell you." Vivian set down the glass she was holding. "I have been looking at something for the past 4 days," Sloane said. "I was not sure enough to say anything until now. 3 weeks ago, the morning after Dorian was admitted, there was a man in the hospital lobby who said he was waiting for a family member in cardiac recovery. I noticed him because he was there for 6 hours and never went upstairs. I noticed him again 2 days later. Different clothes, same man." Vivian said nothing. "I pulled the lobby security footage with help from a contact in the hospital administration. He asked no questions. The man in the lobby made 3 phone calls during those 6 hours. The timestamps on those calls match exactly with the 3 times Dorian's room number was updated in the system. Someone was feeding his location to someone outside the hospital from inside it." Vivian's voice was very quiet. "How is that possible?" "The system updates are logged by terminal. I went through the access records. Every update on Dorian's room that week came from the same terminal. The nurse assigned to that terminal during those shifts has been on staff for 11 months. Her prior employment record shows a private security firm that dissolved 14 months ago. Who owned the firm? The registration lists a holding company. The holding company traces back to a man named Colt Stredwick. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Dorian had said the name once in the ICU, in the flat voice of a man describing something he had been living with for a long time. Colt Stredwick, underboss, 15 years. The man who had sent photographs of Vivian walking to work and said she dies the moment you push back. The man Dorian believed he was close to dismantling. He had a presence inside the hospital, Vivian said, the entire time Dorian was there. From the first night, Sloane said. She sat with this. "He knows Dorian is alive," she said, "from the moment they brought him in." "Yes, and he knows where we live." Sloane did not answer immediately, which was an answer. "How long have you known?" Vivian asked. 4 days. I needed to be certain before I said anything. "I am sorry I waited." "Do not apologize. You were right to be certain. What are you going to do?" Vivian was already moving toward the hallway. Nora's light was still on under the door. She pressed her hand flat against the wall and stood very still and looked at that line of light and thought with complete clarity about what she needed to do next. "Call me or secretary. Call me in 1 hour," she said. "Do not call Dorian directly. Call me." She hung up. She stood in the hallway for 30 seconds. Then she pushed open Nora's door. Nora was in bed, not asleep, reading with a flashlight that she immediately attempted to conceal when the door opened. "Mom." "It is fine," Vivian said. "I just wanted to check on you." Nora lowered the flashlight. She looked at her mother's face with the amber-eyed attention that missed nothing. "You look like when you have a hard case," she said. "I have some work to think about. Go to sleep." Nora lay down without further argument, which told Vivian that her daughter had read the room correctly and was choosing cooperation over curiosity. She was 7 years old and already understood when something was not the moment. Vivian pulled the door closed and went to the kitchen and called Dorian. He answered before the second ring. She told him everything Sloane had found. She spoke quickly and precisely the way she spoke in an OR when the situation required information to travel faster than emotion. She did not editorialize. She did not tell him how she felt about the fact that Stredwick had placed someone inside her hospital for 3 weeks. She told him the facts. He was quiet for 4 seconds after she finished. Then he said, "I need you to write down an address." She found a pen. He gave her an address in the West Village. He told her it was a building he owned under a name that had no searchable connection to him. He told her about the parking garage on the south side and the stairwell that accessed the 4th floor directly. He gave her the door code. "Take Nora there tonight," he said. "Do not call a car. Take the subway to 14th and walk. Sloane too, if she will come." "You are not telling me to stay put," Vivian said. "You already decided you were not going to stay put. I could hear it in your voice when you called." She did not deny this. I will be there in 4 hours, he said. Do not open the door for anyone until you hear 3 knocks and then 2. And Stredwick, I have people moving on his location right now. He does not know I am out of the hospital yet. He thinks I am still sedated and manageable. That window is closing, but it has not closed. 4 hours, she said. 3 and 2. She hung up and went to pack a bag for Nora. They were out of the apartment in 11 minutes. Vivian moved fast, told Nora they were going on an unexpected overnight trip, and used the tone she reserved for situations requiring Nora's cooperation without full explanation. Nora asked one question, "Can I bring my drawing things?" Vivian said yes, and Nora was ready in 4 minutes. Sloan met them at the subway entrance on Atlantic Avenue. She was carrying a medical bag and wearing the expression of someone who had decided to be useful and was not going to discuss the fear component until later. They took the train to 14th Street in a silence that Nora eventually filled by drawing in her sketchbook on her knees the scratch of crayon against paper. A small, ordinary sound in the middle of something that was not ordinary at all. The West Village building was exactly as Dorian had described. Quiet street parking, garage stairwell that smelled like cold concrete and old building materials. The 4th floor was a wide-open space converted into something that was not quite an apartment and not quite an operations room. Clean surfaces, minimal furniture, windows facing the interior courtyard rather than the street, a shelf of supplies, a reinforced door. Nora walked through the space and surveyed it with her standard thoroughness. Then she found a corner near the window, settled herself on the floor with her back against the wall, and opened her sketchbook without comment. "This seems like a safe place," she said. Not as a question. "It is," Vivian said. Nora went back to drawing. Sloan set her medical bag on the table and sat down. She looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at the door. The 4 hours passed. Vivian did not sit down for most of them. She stood by the window facing the courtyard and watched the darkness and thought about Stredwick and about the nurse in the hospital who had been feeding location data to a man who had threatened her life 7 years ago. She thought about the kind of danger that came not from strangers, but from people who had learned the geography of your world from the inside. She thought about Nora drawing in the corner, the scratch of crayon continuous and calm. She was not going to let this world reach her daughter. The knocks came at 3:40 in the morning. 3, then 2. Vivian crossed to the door and opened it. Dorian came through with 2 men behind him. She did not know the men. They moved with the focused economy of people who had done this kind of work for a long time. They checked the room without being asked, checked the windows, the stairwell door, and then positioned themselves outside without making it theatrical. Dorian looked at Vivian, then passed her at Nora, who had looked up from her drawing at the knock and was now watching the door. Nora looked at Dorian for a moment, then she went back to drawing. "He is one of the safe people," she said, apparently to her sketchbook. Dorian looked at Vivian. "She has a category system," Vivian said. "Safe people and not safe people. She developed it on her own when she was 5. He moved to Vivian, kept his voice low. "Stredwick moved his main operation from the Brooklyn location 3 days ago. We believe he was tipped that I was out of the hospital. He has a secondary location in Queens that my people have been tracking. We are moving on it tomorrow night. And the Caruso connection. Rowan Caruso runs the distribution network Stredwick has been feeding for 3 years. Stredwick provides access and intelligence. Caruso provides the infrastructure and the money. Neither of them expected me to resurface. What do you need from me?" "Nothing," he said. "I need you to stay here with Sloan and Nora and let me finish this." She looked at him. The Stredwick I knew would not have put someone inside a hospital for 3 weeks without a fallback plan. He would not have done all of this without something in reserve. "What is it?" A pause. 2 years ago, when I was building documentation for a federal contact, I used a private server that Stredwick had access to the building records for. The documentation is encrypted, but the physical location of the server is not hidden. If he reaches it before I do everything I have been building toward for 7 years is gone. Every name, every route, every piece of evidence. Can he decrypt it? Given enough time, yes. How much time does he have? She watched him calculate. 36 hours from now, he said. She said nothing for a moment. Then you have the address of the server location. He looked at her. "I am a person who operates under pressure for a living," she said. "I am a person who makes precise decisions in situations where imprecision means someone dies. I have spent 7 years making every decision in my life alone and getting them right. Do not look at me like I am something that needs to be stored in a safe room while you handle things." His jaw tightened. "This is not what I want for you," he said. "What you want for me," she said, "is no longer exclusively your decision to make." Sloane, who had been sitting at the table with her medical bag very carefully, did not look up. From her corner, Nora said, "She is right, you know," without looking up from her sketchbook. Both adults looked at her. "She always makes good decisions," Nora said. "She is a doctor." Dorian looked back at Vivian. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite surrender. Something that was both of those things and something older than both. "The server location is in a building in Midtown," he said. "I have a key." "Then we go together," Vivian said. They went the following evening, after Nora was settled with Sloane and two of Dorian's people in the West Village building with the door code changed and a secondary exit identified and tested. Nora had asked where they were going with the directness she applied to everything. Vivian had said to pick something up. Nora had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Okay, and then bring my drawing things back if you see them." "They are at home." "I will," Vivian said. She kissed her daughter's forehead and walked out the door and did not let herself think about it again until the door was closed behind her. The Midtown building was a converted office block on a street that held accounting firms and small legal practices and a dentist on the third floor. Unremarkable by design. The server room was on the ninth floor, accessed through a maintenance corridor that required a physical key and a code that Dorian entered without hesitation. The room was small, climate-controlled, banks of equipment humming in the dark with the patient indifference of machines that did not know what was stored inside them. Dorian went to the correct terminal. Vivian stood at the door and watched the corridor. It was quiet for 4 minutes. Then it was not quiet. The stairwell door at the end of the corridor opened. Two men came through. They moved wrong. The wrongness of people who had not come to fix equipment. Vivian said his name once, flat and clear. He was beside her in 3 seconds, the drive in his hand. They moved toward the secondary stairwell at the far end of the corridor. The men behind them were faster than they should have been, covering the distance with the efficiency of people who had done this in corridors before. They hit the stairwell door. Down, fast. The sound of boots on metal stairs above them, the hollow ring of it multiplying in the shaft. Second floor. Dorian went through the door first, cleared the hallway, pulled her through. Service exit at the end. 40 feet, 30. One of the men came through the stairwell door behind them. Vivian heard the sound of a weapon being raised and turned without fully deciding to turn, and the firearm that Sloane had pressed on her 2 days ago and that she had been carrying in her coat pocket was in her hand. She had fired it twice at the range the day before when Sloane had insisted, and Dorian had stood back and said nothing. She had discovered that her hands were steady, steadier than she expected. The steadiness that lived in the hands, regardless of what the rest of her was feeling. She fired once. The man went down. Dorian turned, looked at her, not with surprise, with the expression of a person who has just seen something confirm what they already believed. "Service exit," she said. He pushed through it. She followed. Outside was an alley. Cold October air, dark the smell of wet concrete and exhaust. A car at the end of the alley with its lights off and one of Dorian's people in the driver's seat. They got in. They moved. Vivian sat in the back seat with the gun still in her hand and her pulse at a rate she could feel in her throat. The image of the man going down printed cleanly in the part of her mind that was already beginning to process it the way it processed everything. Not immediately, later, in the dark, when there was no one watching. "The drive," Dorian said quietly. "I have everything." She looked at the drive in his hand. Then she looked out the window at the city moving past the lights and the traffic and the ordinary nightlife of a city that did not know what had just happened 9 floors up in an unremarkable building. Her hands were steady. She noted this with the same clinical remove she noted everything. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Vivian was awake. She had not slept. She was sitting at the table in the West Village building with cold coffee when her phone lit up with a number she did not recognize. She answered. "Dr. Hartwell?" The voice was male, measured the cadence of someone reading from a prepared position. "My name is Deacon Caruso. I believe you know my brother Rowan." She said nothing. "I want you to understand that I have no personal interest in harming you or your daughter. What I am asking for is a meeting. Rowan and Colt Stredwick have an arrangement with your friend Mr. Fisk that needs to be concluded, and the most efficient way to conclude it is directly. Come to an address I will provide with the drive Mr. Fisk retrieved tonight. In exchange, this ends." "Not a chance," she said. "I understand your hesitation. Let me offer you some context. Right now, 2 of my associates are parked outside this building on Perry Street. They are not there to do anything. They are there to demonstrate that I know exactly where you are. The cold moved through her from the center outward. What do you want? She said. I want Dorian Fisk to come to a location I will provide with the drive. In exchange, you and your daughter are no longer a variable. Vivian. Dorian was standing behind her. She had not heard him come in. He had one hand held out asking for the phone. She gave it to him. She watched his face while he listened. It was the face she had seen across the operating table and in the ICU, the face that did not move when it was calculating, the face that gave nothing away until it decided to give something. He lowered the phone. He looked at Vivian. They are outside, she said. He nodded once. She was already on her feet. Nora, she said. Asleep, Dorian said. My people have the building. Nothing comes through that door tonight. You cannot know that. I know that Deacon Caruso does not want a firefight on a residential street in the West Village at 2 in the morning. What he wants is leverage, and leverage moves if we move correctly. What does moving correctly look like? It looks like you going to Nora right now and staying with her, he said, and it looks like me handling this. She looked at him for a long moment. She walked down the hall to Nora's room. She opened the door quietly. Nora was asleep on her side, one arm around the stuffed animal. She still traveled with her sketchbook on the floor where she had apparently been drawing before she fell asleep. The page it was open to was visible from the doorway. Vivian stepped closer. The lion, larger than the others. The mane filled the whole left side of the page. Standing next to the lion were two figures small and detailed, and next to those two figures was a third, taller, standing close, one hand just barely touching the shoulder of the shorter figure. Not finished, Nora had written in the corner. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed. She listened to Nora breathe. She listened to the building around them, to the quality of silence that meant Dorian's people were in their positions. She listened to the city outside, the distant and continuous sound of it. She sat there and looked at the unfinished drawing and thought about what unfinished meant. About the 7 years she had spent finishing things on her own. About the man in the other room who was about to do something she could not control. About the drawing, about the third figure, about the hand that was almost touching. She stayed in Nora's room until dawn. At 6 in the morning, she heard the front door open. But then footsteps, then stillness. She came into the hallway. Dorian was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked like he had been in a fight that had not resolved cleanly in any direction. His jacket was gone. There was a cut above his left eye closed roughly with butterfly bandages. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, the way hands went when the adrenaline was leaving the body and taking something else with it. He looked up when she came in. Stredwick has consolidated, he said. He knows we have the drive. His Queen's operation is compromised. He has one card remaining. He is going to play it. What is the card? Nora, Dorian said. Deacon told him. And Stredwick is not going to use her as leverage. He is going to use her to end this. Because ending me is the only play he has left. The words sat in the air between them. Vivian stood very still. The man I was. Dorian said the man my father built, that man would have known how to disappear again. Would have sent you both somewhere. Stredwick would never find you and walked away to protect you from a distance. She did not say anything. I am not that man anymore, he said. I have not been that man since the night I saw her standing in that hospital room telling me I had the same nose as her. His voice was entirely level, entirely certain. This ends, he said, completely. Not the way I planned it, faster, but it ends. Vivian crossed the kitchen. She sat down across from him at the table. She looked at his hands and then at his face. Then she said, tell me everything you know about Stredwick's remaining position. And he told her. Later that morning, after the plan had taken its shape, and after Nora had woken and eaten breakfast and drawn something at the table while Dorian watched her with the expression of a man cataloging a world he had nearly lost before he ever had it, Sloane arrived. She came through the door with her medical bag and a second bag that she set on the table without comment. Inside were field dressings, hemostatic gauze, AV kits, and a surgical-grade suture set. I am not interested in being useless, she said before Vivian could speak. I know, Vivian said. I am glad you are here. Nora looked up from her drawing. She looked at Sloane's bags, and then at Sloane, and then back at her drawing without asking any questions. She had the category system. She had already sorted Sloane long ago. The day had its own long quality, the hours between the plan and its execution, filling themselves with a particular suspension of people who had made a decision and were now living in the time before it. Vivian sat with Nora and answered questions about the lion drawing and about what Nora wanted for her birthday in 3 months and about whether it was possible to have a dog in a Brooklyn apartment. She gave honest answers to all of these questions and let the afternoon move at whatever speed it wanted. Dorian sat across the room and watched. At one point, Nora got up from the table and walked across to where he was sitting and climbed into the chair beside him and opened her sketchbook on her knee and drew there simply because she had decided to. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. She just drew and he sat beside her, and the afternoon light came through the courtyard windows and fell across the page. Vivian watched this from across the room. She did not say anything either. Later, when Nora was asleep and the building had settled into its late-night frequency, Dorian came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "I have been thinking about the server documentation," he said, "about what I want to do with it when this is finished." She waited. "All of it goes to the federal contact. Every name, every route, every transaction. I have been building this for 7 years, and when it is handed over, it will not be mine anymore. That is how it should be." She looked at him, and the assets, she said, "when the organization is liquidated." He was quiet for a moment. "There is a thing I have wanted to do for a long time," he said. "A foundation, medical, specifically pediatric cardiac, the people who need the surgeries that cost the most and can afford them the least." She absorbed this. "I want to name it after Nora," he said, "if you would allow that." She looked at him for a long moment. "You should ask her," Vivian said. "Not me, it is her name." He nodded. He asked Nora the following morning before they moved. He sat across from her at the breakfast table and explained in careful language what a foundation was and what it would do. Nora listened with the full attention she brought to things that required consideration. Then she said, "So it would help kids who need heart surgery but cannot afford it." "Yes, like what Mom does. Like what your mother does." "She will be good at that," Nora said, as though this were the primary logistical question. "Yes," he said, "she will." Nora thought for another moment. Then, "Okay, you can use my name." She went back to her breakfast. Dorian looked at Vivian across the kitchen. She turned back to the stove. The drive back from the West Village building to the penthouse the following morning had a quality of suspension to it, the way all mornings had that preceded something that could not be undone. Vivian sat in the back seat with Nora against her shoulder. Nora was reading. She had been reading since they left, the methodical progress of a child who treated books the way she treated everything, with full attention and no wasted motion. At one point, she looked up and watched the city moving past the window. "I think Central Park is the best part of Manhattan," she said. "Why is that?" Vivian asked. "Because it does not try to be anything," Nora said. "It just stays what it is." She went back to her book. Vivian looked out the window at the park as the car moved alongside it. The trees were at the full peak of their October color, the reds and yellows, and the particular amber that she associated now could not help associating with the specific pair of eyes. The park spread out in the morning light with the calm of something that did not need to be other than it was. She thought about what Nora had said, the way a 7-year-old could find the exact right words for something without knowing she was doing it. Just stays what it is. At the building in the sub-level corridor before the panic room door, Dorian had knelt down to Nora's level and spoken to her quietly while Sloane and Vivian gave them the distance for it. Vivian could not hear the words. She watched Nora's face instead, the way she watched it when she needed to know what was actually being communicated beneath the surface of an exchange. Nora was listening with the full attention she reserved for things she was taking seriously. Then she nodded once with a gravity that was entirely adult and entirely her own. "Okay," she said, and she turned and walked into the panic room without looking back, with the manner of a child who had made a decision and was executing it. Vivian had looked at Dorian. He stood up. His face was the controlled face, but his hands were not entirely steady, and he did not attempt to conceal this. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her that she was the bravest person in the building and that I would come back for her." He paused. "I told her that this time when I say I am coming back, I am coming back." Vivian looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator and the maintenance corridor and whatever the next hours were going to require of her. Later, after the penthouse, after the corridor and the drive and the study door, and the stillness that came after, she sat in the back seat of the car on the way back down and thought about Dorian's hands, about the way they had not been steady, about the man who had learned the language of steadiness the same way she had, out of necessity, out of survival, and who had not been able to maintain it when talking to a 7-year-old girl about coming back. She thought about the watch on the window ledge, about the specific deliberateness of placing it there. An object that had been part of a man for years and years, set down without ceremony, left behind, the account closed, and the item no longer needed. She thought about what it meant to close an account, to set down the thing that had defined a long chapter and walk away from it. She was still thinking about this when they reached the West Village building, and she came through the door, and Nora looked up from her sketchbook and said without preamble, "I knew you would come back." "Yes," Dorian said. "I said I would." "I know," Nora said. "That is how I knew." She went back to her drawing. Vivienne set her coat on the table and looked at the room and the people in it, at Sloane already reorganizing her medical bag, at Dorian standing just inside the door, with the weight of the last several hours on him in a way that was visible but not defeated, at Nora drawing on the floor in the corner with her sketchbook, the pencil moving in the patient way that meant she was working on something she cared about. She thought about the 7 years, about everything that had accumulated in them, about what she had built and what she had carried and what she had set down and what had not been settable down, and the difference between those two categories which she had not always been able to distinguish clearly and which were now for the first time beginning to resolve into something she could see. She crossed the room and sat down next to Nora on the floor. Nora did not look up but shifted slightly to make room without interrupting the drawing. Vivienne sat against the wall and looked at the page. The lion, the 3 figures, the hand just touching the shoulder. She sat there for a while. After a moment, Nora leaned slightly against her, the small, warm weight of her daughter's shoulder against hers, the way she had been doing since she was small enough to be carried, the unconscious seeking of contact that children did when they were settled and safe. Vivienne put her arm around her. They sat together while Dorian talked quietly with Sloane across the room, and the city made its sound outside the window, and the lamp on the shelf cast its circle of light across the floor. "Not finished," it still said in the corner of the drawing, "but closer. Definitely closer." The plan came together the way surgical plans came together. Not with certainty, with the best available information applied to the most controllable variables, with contingencies built around the ones that could not be controlled, and with the understanding that at some point the situation would diverge from the plan, and the only thing that would matter then was the quality of the judgment in the room. Dorian laid it out on the kitchen table at 7 in the morning while the city outside was beginning its early shift, and Nora was still asleep down the hall. Stredwick had consolidated to one location, the penthouse on Central Park West that Dorian's family had held for 30 years, the building that Dorian himself had lived in for a decade before he disappeared. The one place Stredwick had always treated as untouchable because it was too visible, too public, too embedded in legitimate real estate records to be used for anything operational. He was using it now because he was out of options and he knew it. Dorian had 6 people he trusted completely. He named them at the table. Vivienne noted them not as names but as functions, the way she noted a surgical team. Who was responsible for what? Who covered which approach? What the fallback was if the primary approach failed. The penthouse had 3 standard access points: private elevator from the lobby, service elevator from the parking level, emergency stairwell on the 41st floor. Stredwick would have people covering all 3. Dorian's advantage was that he had lived in that building for a decade, and Stredwick had not. "There is a 4th access," Dorian said. "A maintenance corridor on the 42nd floor that connects to the adjacent building. It was sealed off in 2019 when the building next door changed ownership. I had the seal mechanism installed. Stredwick knows about every access point I ever showed him. He does not know about the ones I kept to myself." She understood this without needing it explained further. "The panic room is on the sub-level," Vivienne said. He looked at her. "I have been listening," she said. "You mentioned it when you were going through the layout. Sub-level reinforced independent power. That is where Nora goes. That is where Nora and Sloane go, and that is where they stay, regardless of what happens above them." Dorian nodded. "The code," she said. He gave it to her. She wrote it on her hand. Then she memorized it and crossed it out. She woke Nora at 7:30. Nora surfaced slowly, processing the transition from sleep to wakefulness with the methodical approach she brought to everything. She looked at her mother's face and then at the window. "Are we going somewhere?" Nora asked. "Yes," Vivienne said. "In a little while. Are you hungry?" Nora considered. "Yes." Vivienne made eggs. She stood at the small stove and made scrambled eggs and toast and set them on the table and sat across from her daughter and watched her eat. Nora ate with the focused attention she brought to things she liked. She did not ask questions. She watched her mother the way she always watched her when she sensed the situation required observation rather than inquiry. This was one of the things about Nora. She had an instinct for register. She knew when to ask and when to watch. Vivian did not know where she had gotten it. She suspected she had gotten it from the same place she had gotten the amber eyes. After breakfast, Nora asked for her drawing things. Vivian brought them. Nora sat at the table and opened her sketchbook to the lion page and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and began to add to it. Vivian watched from across the room. The third figure next to the lion was getting more detail. Not much, just enough to make it specific. The way a child added detail to something that had moved from idea to fact. Dorian came through the kitchen doorway and stopped when he saw the drawing. Nora looked up. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "I am finishing it," she said. She went back to drawing. Dorian crossed to the counter and poured coffee and stood for a moment with his back to the room. When he turned around, his face was the controlled face, the operational face, but at the edges of it, something was visible that had not been there 7 years ago and had not been there before. A 7-year-old told him he had the same nose as her and handed him a crayon lion with both hands. Sloane arrived at 9. She came through the door with both bags, the medical one and the second one that contained things she had prepared because she was Sloane, and Sloane prepared for what the situation actually required. "I am not interested in being somewhere else while this happens," she said. "I know," Vivian said. "I already counted you in." Nora looked up from her drawing and looked at Sloane with the category system running. "You are one of the safe ones too," Nora said. "Yes," Sloane said. "I know." They moved to the penthouse at 2 in the afternoon. The convoy was 2 vehicles. Dorian rode in the first with 3 of his people. Vivian rode in the second with Nora and Sloane and the remaining 2. Nora sat between Vivian and the window with her sketchbook open on her knees, drawing the scratch of pencil against paper, a sound that Vivian found herself anchoring to during the 20-minute drive up the west side. She looked at her daughter's profile, the concentration in it, the complete absorption in the work of the drawing, the 7 years of mornings and school pickups, and late-night fevers and homework and lion drawings and Saturday pancakes that Vivian had assembled alone, one day at a time, into the shape of a childhood that was whole. She was not going to let anything touch this child. This was not a decision. It was a fact of the same order as biological facts. The same order as respiration and circulation. Not chosen, simply true. Simply. The building on Central Park West rose 42 floors against the October sky. The park spread out beside it, the trees at the edge of their color, the last of the season's warmth still visible in the light off the water. It was a beautiful afternoon in the way Manhattan afternoons sometimes were, casually and almost cruelly beautiful, indifferent to whatever was happening inside the buildings it illuminated. Dorian's people cleared the lobby in 4 minutes. The private elevator to the sub-level required a key that Dorian produced without ceremony. The sub-level was utilitarian pipes and conduit running along concrete walls, storage units, mechanical rooms. The panic room was at the far end of a corridor behind a door that looked like a utility access and was not. Dorian keyed the panel. The door released with the sound of serious engineering, thick and precise. Inside was a room approximately 12 feet by 14. Independent air supply. Its own power. A bank of monitors showing feeds from multiple cameras throughout the building. A first aid cabinet, a water supply, a communication system. 2 cots against the wall. Nora walked in and looked around with the standard survey. "It is like a fort," she said. "Yes," Vivian said. Nora went to one of the monitors. She studied the camera feeds with the interest she brought to anything mechanical or systematic. She pointed to a feed showing the 42nd floor corridor. "That is up high," she said. "That is where we are going to be," Vivian said. She knelt down. She did something she had not planned to do, something that the operational part of her had argued against on the grounds that it would make the next hour harder to execute. She put both hands on Nora's shoulders and looked directly at her. Nora looked back. "You are going to stay in here with Sloane," Vivian said. "You are going to stay in here no matter what you hear. The door locks from the inside and nothing that exists can open it from the outside without the code. Do you understand?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to be safe?" she asked. She said it the same way she had asked it in the West Village building. Quiet, direct, not asking for reassurance, asking for the truth. Vivian looked at her daughter's face, at the amber eyes that were entirely Dorian's and the set of the jaw that was entirely Nora's own, something she had grown herself out of whatever materials the world had given her. I intend to be, Vivian said. That is as much as I can promise you. Nora looked at her for another moment. Then she stepped forward and put both arms around Vivian's neck and held on. Vivian held her back. She pressed her face against her daughter's dark hair. She stayed there for exactly the amount of time she could stay there and still be able to let go. Then she let go. She stood up. Sloane was watching from near the door with an expression she was not attempting to hide. Vivian met her eyes. If anything comes through that door, Sloane said, that is not you or Dorian using the right sequence. I have a scalpel and absolutely no hesitation. I know, Vivian said. I am counting on it. She walked out. The door closed behind her with the sound of serious engineering. Locked. She stood in the corridor for one breath. Then she went to find Dorian. The maintenance corridor on the 42nd floor was exactly as he had described. A narrow passage between structural elements, the kind of space that existed in old Manhattan buildings because they had been revised and expanded over decades without full coherence. The seal was a panel that Dorian removed in 40 seconds with a tool from his jacket. On the other side was a short corridor that connected to the back of the penthouse service area. They went through. The penthouse was a space Vivian had seen once 7 years ago briefly on an evening that had been something else entirely. She registered it now with the rapid assessment she applied to every new environment. Entry points, sight lines, cover, distance between them. Stredwick had 4 people positioned through the main floor. Dorian had predicted 3 of their positions correctly based on the building layout and standard defensive logic. The 4th was in the kitchen, which meant either good information or adaptability. The next 6 minutes were the kind of minutes that compressed and expanded at the same time. What Vivian retained afterward was a series of specific images, each one complete and separate. The sound of the first contact in the East Wing, controlled and fast, moving through the service corridor toward the kitchen. The 4th man coming through the wrong door at the wrong moment. Dorian moving to intercept. Vivian taking the angle they had discussed covering the main hallway approach. A 2nd man coming from the hallway at a run. The weight of the firearm in her hand. The steadiness she had found in the Midtown corridor. The steadiness that lived in the hands below the level of everything else. One shot. The man went down. Dorian glanced at her across the room. A single look. She nodded. He moved. The penthouse went quiet. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of a space where the variables had resolved and the situation had arrived at whatever its outcome was going to be. Stredwick was in the study on the north side. Dorian had told her this would likely be where he waited. The camera feeds in the panic room had confirmed it. And the quality of the silence from that direction was the silence of a man who had heard what happened in the other rooms and had made his calculation. Dorian went to the study door. He stopped. He looked at Vivian. There was something in his face she did not see there often. Not fear. Something older than fear. The weight of 15 years and what they had built and what they had cost and what it meant to walk through a door to settle something that could not be settled in any other way. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. She positioned herself at the corridor to hold the approach from the elevator bank, to cover the one remaining variable. The study door opened, closed. She stood in the corridor and listened. She did not hear the words, only the register of the conversation. 2 voices, low, the cadence of men who had known each other long enough that the surface formalities had burned away completely years ago. It was not anger she heard. She had expected anger. What she heard instead was something older and more absolute. The sound of a debt being called that had only one currency. Stredwick's voice once saying something she could not make out. Then a pause long enough to have a shape. Then Dorian's voice very quiet saying 5 words she could make out clearly. 15 years I trusted you. Then nothing. She stood in the corridor. The October light came through the windows at the end of the hall flat and clear. It showed everything exactly as it was. Dorian came out of the study. He was holding something in his left hand. Small. A watch. The kind of watch that had been on a man's wrist for a long time and had its own weight from that. He set it on the narrow ledge of the window frame as he came through the door. Set it down with the deliberateness of a man placing the final item of an accounting. He looked at Vivian. She read his face. He was intact. There was a cut on his forearm, and the way he was holding his left side suggested a rib had taken impact, but intact in the way that mattered. It is done, he said. She looked at the watch on the window ledge, at what it represented and what it was now, an object on a ledge, nothing more. She took out her phone and called Sloane's number. It rang once. We are clear, Vivian said. 3 and 2 on the door. Understood, Sloane said. Her voice was entirely herself, which meant she was covering everything else with the competence she always deployed. Give us 3 minutes. They were closer to 6. When the panic room door opened, Sloan came through, first medical bag already in hand, eyes moving immediately to Dorian's arm and left side. Nora came through behind her. She walked directly to Vivian, not running, walking in the deliberate way she moved when she was managing her own response to something. She came to Vivian and stood in front of her and looked at her face with the complete attention she had brought to Dorian's face in the hospital room weeks ago. Vivian let her look. Nora reached up and touched the side of Vivian's jaw with 2 fingers, the way a child verified something they needed to confirm was real. You are okay, Nora said. Not a question. Yes, Vivian said. Nora dropped her hand. Then she turned and looked at Dorian, who was submitting to Sloane's examination of his arm, with the patience of someone who had learned that arguing with Sloane was not an efficient use of time. She looked at his face, then at the arm, then back at his face. Does it hurt? She asked. Yes, he said. She nodded as though this confirmed something she had needed confirmed. Then she went to her bag and took out her sketchbook and sat down on the floor against the wall and opened it to the lion page. She drew for a few minutes in silence. Then she tore the page out carefully along the seam. She stood up. She crossed to Dorian and held it out. I finished it, she said. He took it with the same two-handed care he had used with the first drawing. He looked at it for a long time. The lion in the center of the page. 2 figures beside it and the third now with enough detail to be specific and real and placed. A hand that was no longer almost touching a shoulder. A hand that was touching it. He looked up at Nora. It is the same lion, Nora said. I just kept adding to it. I can see that, he said. Vivian turned toward the window, looked at the October light on the park 42 floors below the trees at the edge of their color, the water catching the late afternoon sun. She breathed in, breathed out, let the room hold what it was holding without trying to name it yet. The federal contact came through 4 days later. Dorian met with 2 agents from the Organized Crime Division at a location Vivian was not present for and was not given the address of. She understood why and accepted this as part of the larger shape of things that were still resolving. She was not the person who handed over the drive. She was the person who had helped make it possible to hand over. These were different roles, and she was at peace with the distinction. What she was told afterward in the kitchen of the West Village building over coffee that was for once still warm was that the drive contained documentation sufficient to close 3 active federal investigations and open 4 new ones. That the names on it reached into 2 state governments, 1 federal agency, and a real estate network that had been running as a front for 20 years. That Rowan Caruso was in custody. That 2 of the 3 remaining operational figures in Stredwick's network were in custody. That the 3rd had agreed to cooperate in exchange for terms the contact could not discuss. Dorian said this without pride. He said it the way a surgeon said the patient is stable, as the correct outcome of the correct procedure applied with sufficient precision, as the end of something that had needed to end for a very long time. And you, she said, the contact arranged an agreement. I spent 7 years building the documentation. I handed over the network. The agreement covers my role in dismantling it. There are conditions and a process, and it will take time to complete. But I am not going to prison. She absorbed this. And the foundation, she said, he nodded, all assets that can be liquidated go into a trust. The federal contact administers it. I have input into how it is structured and what it funds. The Nora Hartwell Foundation. Pediatric cardiac surgery for families who cannot afford it. She looked at him across the table. She thought about this drive, about the 7 years of documentation, about the men in the Midtown corridor and the watch on the window ledge, about the pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue and the ring she had walked past twice a week for 4 years, and the morning she sat on a bathroom floor with a pregnancy test in the silence in that apartment. She thought about Nora drawing at the kitchen table with the scratch of pencil against paper. That was the most ordinary sound in the world. She thought about what it cost to survive something and what it meant to come out the other side of it, carrying everything you went in with and everything you picked up along the way. I believe you, she said. He looked at her. That is the first time you have said that, he said. Yes, she said. It is. 6 months passed. The way 6 months passed when the crisis was over and the rebuilding had begun and a new shape of life was being assembled, one ordinary day at a time. Sloan returned to Crown Metropolitan and managed Vivian's extended absence with the creative administrative fluency she had developed over years of working alongside someone whose life occasionally generated complications that did not fit standard paperwork. Vivian returned to the OR. She was there on her first morning back before six in scrubs at the sink, her hands under the water, and the calm of the operating room settling around her like something she had left behind somewhere and had been slightly cold without ever since. She stood at the table and picked up the scalpel, and it was exactly as it had always been. Precise and clean and completely her own. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. But she was also other things now. She was beginning to understand the full catalog. They moved into a house in Westchester in the early spring. Not a large house. 3 bedrooms, a yard that was slightly overgrown in a way that promised possibility rather than neglect a street quiet enough that Nora could play outside without constant supervision. A commute to Crown Metropolitan that required a train and was therefore longer than Vivian preferred and worth it anyway. Dorian carried boxes. He was not efficient at it. He had lived most of his adult life in spaces where other people managed the physical logistics, and his inexperience with it was both apparent and something he applied himself to, with the focused determination he brought to things he had decided to get right. Nora supervised him with the authority of a child who had moved before and considered herself the household expert. "Put that one in the kitchen," Nora said, pointing. "It says bathroom on the label," Dorian said. "I know where it goes better than the label does," Nora said. He put it in the kitchen. Vivian stood in the doorway of the main room with a cup of coffee and watched this and did not say anything and felt something in her chest that had no clinical name and did not require one. The wedding was in September, not announced, not large. A chapel on the Hudson that Sloan had found through a contact she declined to specify on a Saturday morning when the light off the water was the quality of early autumn light that made everything it touched look like it had been considered. 12 people total, Sloan, who served as witness, and wore the expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific outcome for a long time and was not going to make a speech about it. Several of Dorian's people, whose presence meant things that did not require explanation. A few others. And Nora, who had selected her own dress, white with small embroidered details at the collar that she had examined carefully in the store and approved on the basis that they were interesting, who had been consulted on the flowers and had opinions, who walked between her parents down the short aisle of the chapel holding one hand on each side with the serious and complete attention of someone participating in something important. The officiant asked the standard questions. The architecture of a ceremony that existed precisely because some things needed to be spoken out loud in front of witnesses to become fully real. When he asked Vivian, she looked at Dorian. She looked at the man who had been on her operating table in October and in her ICU, and in a West Village kitchen at 3 in the morning with the butterfly bandages above his eye. The man who had left a note on her kitchen table that said, "I am sorry," and who had come back with 4 bullet holes in his chest, and who had looked at their daughter for the first time with two-handed care as though she were made of something that could not be replaced. She thought about what the years had cost, both of them, separately, the cost of living through time alone when time was not supposed to be lived alone. She thought about the note, the ring she had sold, the October morning with the pregnancy test and the silence in the apartment. She thought about Nora finishing the lion drawing, about the third figure, about the hand that was no longer almost touching. "I do," she said. His voice was completely steady when he said it back. The voice of a man who had thought about this specific moment for a long time and had arrived at it exactly as he had intended. They walked out of the chapel into the September light. Nora walked between them again, holding both hands, and then she let go of Vivian's hand and let go of Dorian's hand and ran ahead down the path toward the water because she was 7.5 years old and the river was there and some things could not wait. Vivian and Dorian walked behind her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Dorian reached into his jacket and produced a small box. He opened it without ceremony and held it out. She looked down. The ring was the same. Small diamond, simple band. The ring he had given her 11 years ago on a rooftop in Midtown, and that she had kept in a drawer for 4 months and then carried to a pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue on a gray February morning and set on the counter without drama. She looked up at him. 2 years, he said. Every pawn shop, every estate auction, every collector in the city. I found it 14 months ago and I waited for today. She looked at the ring in the box. She understood what this was. She understood what it had cost him to find it and what it cost him now to hold it out to her. She understood that he had known about the pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue, had known about the twice-a-week walks past the window, had understood what the selling of it meant, and had spent 2 years trying to give back the one thing from that time that could be given back. She took it from the box, slipped it onto her finger. It fit exactly the way it had always fit. Some things did not change with years. She looked out at the river where Nora was standing at the railing, with her arms spread and her face into the wind, doing the things she had started doing lately that Vivian had no explanation for, except that she was 8 and the world was still a thing to be run toward. "This is where I say something appropriate," Dorian said. "You do not have to say anything," Vivian said. "I want to." She waited. He looked at Nora at the railing, then at Vivian, then at the ring on her hand. "I spent 7 years believing that leaving was the only way to keep you alive," he said. "I was wrong. Not about the threat. The threat was real. I was wrong about what survival required. I thought survival was the absence of danger. I understand now that it is not." He paused. "Survival is this, whatever this is." She looked at him. "Whatever this is," she said. He almost smiled. They walked down to where Nora was standing at the railing. 5 years after that, Vivian was in the OR at Crown Metropolitan at 7 in the morning. A 15-year-old girl from a family in the Bronx. Parents who had sat in the waiting room for 4 hours before the financial coordinator came out and told them the procedure was covered entirely by the Nora Hartwell Foundation, which was now in its 4th year of operation and had funded more than 300 surgeries at hospitals across the northeastern United States. The surgery took 3 hours and 40 minutes. A congenital defect that had been watched for years and had arrived at the threshold where it needed to be corrected or it would not be correctable. Vivian worked with the precision she had been building for 12 years, the kind of precision that was no longer something she applied consciously, but something she simply was, the way certain things became structural over time. She closed the chest, stepped back from the table. "Stable," she said. The team exhaled, the particular exhale of people who had held something in and were now allowed to release it. She stripped her gloves and walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment in the fluorescent light. The same corridor she had stood in the morning after Dorian's surgery, in the corridor outside OR2, with shaking hands she had not let anyone see. Her hands were not shaking. She took the elevator down to the lobby. Dorian was there. He came sometimes when she had a long surgery. He was sitting in one of the chairs against the window, with the stillness that was simply him, now the quality of attention he brought to waiting for things that mattered. Beside him was Nora, 12 years old, serious in the way she had always been serious. Sketchbook on her knee. She was drawing with the concentration she brought to it, one leg folded under her pencil, moving in the deliberate way that meant she was working on something specific. When she saw Vivian come through the elevator doors, she looked up. "How did it go?" Nora asked. "She is going to be fine," Vivian said. Nora nodded. "Good." She went back to drawing. Vivian sat in the chair next to Dorian. He passed her the coffee he had been holding still warm. She took it. The lobby of Crown Metropolitan was doing what it always did. People moving through it in every direction, the continuous traffic of a place where lives arrived and departed and were held suspended in the particular uncertainty of the medical. It was the sound of a hospital that never stopped, and she had learned to hear it not as noise, but as the sound of the work continuing, of the work always continuing, of the work being the one constant in a life that had rearranged itself around her more than once. After a moment, she said, "What are you working on?" Nora held up the sketchbook without stopping. It was the lion, the same lion. She could tell by the proportions, by the specific weight of the mane, by the eyes that had always been the same eyes since the first one. It was the same lion that had been on the refrigerator door in the Brooklyn apartment and in the hospital room and on the floor of the West Village building and in the hands of a man who had taken it with two-handed care and kept it on a table beside his bed. The same lion added to over the years, returned to and developed and made more specific and more real. The way things became more real when you kept returning to them. 3 figures beside it, as there had always been 3, but larger now, more detailed. The proportions of people who had gotten older and had the years on them. The hand on the shoulder no longer something tentative or approximate, something definite, something that had been there long enough to belong there. "It is the same lion," Nora said. "I just keep adding to it." Vivian looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she looked at Dorian. He was looking at Nora draw. With the quality of attention of a man who understood he had been given something he had not expected and had spent 5 years trying to be equal to it and was still every morning trying. She looked out the lobby windows at the city. October again. The trees in the park at the edge of their color. The light flat and clear showing everything exactly as it was. She thought about the operating table on the night of the storm. About the 3 seconds when her clinical mind and everything else she had built simply stopped functioning at the same time. About the choice her hands had already made before the rest of her had caught up. She had saved him because she could not do otherwise. Because some things were structural, built into you below the level of decision, below the level of choice. Because whatever 7 years had done to the love she had for this man, it had not done enough. It had not touched the part that was below the part that could be touched. She had not known this until her hands were already moving. She thought about Nora at 2 in the morning with the flashlight and the drawing that said, "For Mama." About the amber eyes in the dark hallway that were entirely his and entirely their daughter's, at the same time the way children took what they were given and made it their own completely. About a 7-year-old who had walked into a hospital room and told a stranger he had the same nose as her and handed him a drawing with both hands and changed the direction of everything. She thought about the note on the kitchen table, about the pawn shop on Atlantic Avenue, about what she had built in the years after the residency, the practice, the apartment, the mornings and the school runs, and the lion drawings accumulating on the refrigerator door until there were too many to display, but she had never been able to throw any of them away. She thought about what it meant to survive something, not to move past it, not to leave it behind, to carry it forward into the shape of the life you were still building, to add to it the way Nora added to the lion without erasing what was already there, to keep returning to it until it became more real, more specific, more definitively itself. The ring was on her hand. It had always fit. Some things did not change with years. Nora tore the page out along the seam. She looked at it for a moment, the private consideration of an artist assessing finished work. Then she handed it to Vivian. "It is finished," she said. Vivian took it. She looked at it for a long time. The lion, the 3 figures, the hand on the shoulder, the detail of people who had lived in the drawing long enough to become exactly themselves. At the bottom, in the handwriting that had grown from the careful printing of a 7-year-old into the cursive of a 12-year-old who still pressed slightly too hard with her pencil, Nora had written 2 words. All of them. Vivian looked at those 2 words. She looked at her daughter, who had gone back to her sketchbook and was already turning to the next page, already beginning the next thing, moving forward the way she had always moved forward, with the full attention of someone who understood that the work was never completely finished, and that this was not a problem, but simply the nature of work worth doing. She folded the lion page carefully and put it in the pocket of her coat. Then she sat in the lobby of Crown Metropolitan Hospital on a clear October morning, with her husband beside her and her daughter drawing next to them, and the coffee still warm in her hand, and the city outside the windows doing what it always did, and she felt the weight of the drawing in her coat pocket, and the weight of the ring on her hand, and the weight of everything that had led to this particular chair on this particular morning. And she found that it was not heavy. It was the opposite of heavy. It was the weight of things that had been carried a long distance and had arrived. She finished the coffee, set the cup down, looked at the lobby around her and the people moving through it and the work continuing behind every closed door in this building, the work that never stopped, the work she had given her life to and that had given her back more than she had put in. She had gotten very good at keeping things alive. Not just in the OR. Outside the windows, the October light lay flat and clear across the park. The trees were at the edge of their color. The water caught the morning sun and held it for a moment and then let it go, the way water always did, the way everything that was still moving always did and would and should. The morning after the wedding, Vivian woke before Dorian and went downstairs in the Westchester house that still had unpacked boxes in the corners and curtains that were not entirely right for the windows, and a kitchen that did not yet know her rhythms. She made coffee, stood at the window over the sink, and looked at the backyard in the early light. The yard was overgrown in a way that had been charming when they looked at the house in March, and that now, with the first frost coming, looked like a project. There was a tree at the back of the property that was old enough to have a particular authority about it, the kind of tree that had been there before the house and would be there after, the kind of tree that made a yard feel like it had history. Nora had noticed the tree immediately, had stood under it on the day they moved in, and looked up through the branches and said, "That is a good one." Vivian looked at it now in the early light. She heard Dorian come downstairs behind her. He moved quietly, the habit of many years in many rooms, and the kind of vigilance that did not simply turn off because the threat had resolved. She had noticed this in the weeks since the penthouse, the way he moved through spaces, always aware of entry points and sight lines, always placing himself between the door and wherever Nora happened to be. It was not dramatic. It was structural, built into him, the way her steadiness in the OR was built into her. She supposed they were both people who had been shaped by what they had needed to become. He came and stood beside her at the window. Did not speak for a moment. Just looked at the yard in the early light, the way she was looking at it. "The tree needs some work," he said finally. "The whole yard needs work," she said. "I know." He was quiet for another moment. "I would like to do it, if you will let me." She looked at him. She understood what he was actually saying, not about the yard. She looked back at the tree. "Yes," she said. "I will let you." He poured himself coffee. They stood at the window together and watched the light change over the yard and the tree. And the morning did what mornings did in houses that were becoming homes. It simply continued unhurried, full of the ordinary material of lives being lived. From upstairs, after a while, they heard Nora wake. The particular sound of her moving around her room, the creak of the floor, the sound of a drawer opening, the sounds of a child inhabiting a space and beginning to make it hers. Then her footsteps on the stairs. She came into the kitchen with her hair loose and her pajamas still on and her sketchbook under her arm because she brought it everywhere because for Nora, the drawing was never far away. She looked at both of them, standing at the window. She went to the cabinet where the cereal was kept because she had cataloged the kitchen in the first 3 days and knew where everything was. She poured herself cereal, sat at the table, opened her sketchbook. She looked at the tree in the yard through the window. Then she began to draw, and the morning continued.